11-year-old Randall Conklin approached and fatally shot 17-year-old Michael Turpin at point-blank range in Balboa Park, killing him instantly with a single bullet to the chest. The midday attack occurred in front of horrified onlookers who were enjoying the sunny day at the popular recreation area, sending families scrambling for cover as the sound of gunfire echoed across the normally peaceful grounds. Randall, a fifth grader at nearby Lincoln Elementary School, had concealed a 9mm handgun in his Spider-Man backpack, walking directly up to Michael, who was seated on a bench near the basketball courts in an area known locally as a boundary between rival gang territories. The small shooter, described by witnesses as eerily calm, fired without hesitation before tucking the weapon away and walking, not running, from the scene, leaving behind the body of a teenage boy and a community in shock. The peaceful facade of San Diego, with its perfect weather and tourist-friendly beaches, had long masked a growing problem with territorial gang violence that had been creeping into younger demographics. The shooting occurred in the east section of Balboa Park, a 200-acre urban cultural park that, while mostly known for its museums, gardens, and the famous San Diego Zoo, had certain areas that had become contested territory between rival gangs seeking to control drug sales. The boundary lines of these invisible territories were known to gang members but completely invisible to the tourists and families who frequented the park, creating a dangerous overlap of recreational space and criminal enterprise. Local law enforcement had noticed an alarming trend of younger recruits being brought into these gangs, but few could have predicted that elementary school children were being enlisted as soldiers in this urban war. Randall Conklin did not fit the stereotype many would expect of a juvenile killer. He came from a middle-class home in a relatively safe neighborhood, had no previous arrests, and was described by teachers as quiet but not problematic. His parents, divorced 3 years prior, both worked full-time jobs, with Randall often left unsupervised in the critical after-school hours when he should have been in childcare or activities. The lack of oversight had created a vacuum that was filled by older boys in the neighborhood who belonged to the West Side Locos, a gang that had recently begun recruiting younger members to carry out tasks that would result in minimal consequences due to their age. Randall had been seen hanging around known gang members in the months prior to the shooting, but neither his parents nor his teachers had recognized the danger signs of his new associations. If you're enjoying this crime story, please hit the subscribe button and let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Now, let's get back to the story. Michael Turpin, the victim, was a senior at San Diego High School and a star basketball player who was being scouted by several colleges for athletic scholarships. He had peripheral connections to the East Side Kings, a rival gang to the West Side Locos, primarily through family members, but according to friends, he had been trying to distance himself from those associations to focus on his sports career. The territorial dispute between the two gangs had escalated in the weeks leading up to the shooting, with several incidents of vandalism and 2 non-fatal stabbings reported in the area around Balboa Park. Michael was not believed to have been directly involved in any of these incidents, suggesting he may have been targeted symbolically rather than for any specific action, a brutal message sent through the most unexpected messenger. The brazenness of the attack, committed in broad daylight by a child so young, sent shockwaves through the San Diego community and made national headlines within hours. Parents kept their children home from school. Park attendance plummeted, and city officials faced hard questions about the failure to address gang recruitment tactics targeting younger children. The shooting represented a horrifying new chapter in juvenile crime, one that challenged existing frameworks for understanding and addressing youth violence. Experts in juvenile justice immediately began weighing in on the case, raising questions about whether an 11-year-old could truly understand the permanence of death or the full consequences of taking a human life. The age of the shooter complicated every aspect of the case, from the investigation to the eventual prosecution, forcing authorities to navigate uncharted legal territory while under intense public scrutiny. Security camera footage from a museum entrance approximately 100 yards from the shooting site captured Randall entering the park 20 minutes before the murder, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his expression focused rather than playful, like the other children around him. The same camera caught him leaving 8 minutes after the estimated time of the shooting, his body language noticeably different, more rigid, his path direct and purposeful rather than the meandering route he had taken on his way in. This footage would later become crucial evidence, as it clearly showed the clothing Randall was wearing, a distinctive white and blue striped polo shirt and khaki shorts that witnesses also described seeing on the shooter. The same outfit, despite attempts to clean it, would eventually provide one of the most damning pieces of evidence against the young killer. What investigators found most disturbing in the immediate aftermath was not just the age of the suspected shooter, but the complete lack of panic in his demeanor as described by witnesses. Multiple people reported seeing a small boy walk away from the scene like he was leaving a friend's house, with no visible distress or urgency that would typically accompany such a traumatic event. This unnatural calmness suggested either a profound lack of understanding about what he had done, or, more disturbingly, a complete detachment from the gravity of taking another person's life. Child psychologists would later debate whether this reaction represented a developmental inability to process the consequences of his actions or indicated a more concerning pattern of callous and unemotional traits that sometimes predict future violent behavior. As the sun set on San Diego that September evening, the body of Michael Turpin was taken to the county medical examiner's office, and a city found itself facing uncomfortable questions about how a child, still young enough to be playing with toys, had become an instrument of gang violence. Parents across the city held their children closer that night, schools prepared crisis counselors for the coming days, and police began the difficult task of investigating a murder where the prime suspect couldn't legally see a PG-13 movie without supervision. The case would challenge not only the legal system's approach to juvenile offenders, but also force a community to examine how it had failed 2 young lives. One ended violently and another forever, altered by an act of violence that no child should be capable of committing. Michael Turpin's bedroom remained untouched in the months following his death, a shrine to a life cut short at just 17 years old. Basketball trophies lined the shelves, college recruitment letters were pinned to a bulletin board, and his San Diego High School varsity jersey hung on the back of his door, tangible reminders of the future that had been stolen from him that day in Balboa Park. His mother, Tasha Turpin, a hospital nurse who had raised Michael and his 2 younger siblings on her own after their father's death from cancer 5 years earlier, kept the room exactly as Michael had left it that morning, unable to pack away the remnants of her eldest son's dreams. Photos around the room showed Michael at various basketball tournaments, his tall frame and bright smile a constant, his obvious talent on full display in action shots that captured his graceful movements on the court. The most recent addition was a letter from UCLA expressing interest in having him visit the campus, an opportunity that Michiel had been excitedly planning for when his life was violently ended by an elementary school child with a gun. He was going to be the first in our family to go to college, Tasha Turpin told reporters, her eyes fixed on a team photo on her son's desk. Basketball was his ticket out, his way to make something of himself beyond what this neighborhood expects of young black men. Michael had maintained a 3.4 GPA while starring on his school's basketball team, balancing academics and athletics with a determination that impressed his coaches and teachers alike. His high school basketball coach, James Hernandez, described Michael as a natural leader who took younger players under his wing and pushed his teammates to excel both on the court and in the classroom. The college recruitment letters that had begun arriving in his junior year represented not just athletic recognition, but the promise of educational opportunities that could permanently alter his life trajectory, opportunities that ended with a single gunshot. Michiel's journey to becoming a star athlete had not been an easy one, as his family lived in an area of San Diego where gang influence was strong, and many of his childhood friends had already been pulled into that life. His uncle, DeAndre Turpin, had been associated with the East Side Kings in his youth and still maintained loose connections to the gang, creating a complicated family dynamic that Michael navigated carefully. Michael knew what that life led to, prison or the cemetery, and he wanted no part of it, DeAndre explained during a community memorial service held at San Diego High School's gymnasium. He used basketball as his shield, staying in the gym when others were out on the streets, using his talent to create a different path for himself. Friends described Michael as funny, loyal, and focused, someone who could light up a room with his laugh, but also demonstrate remarkable discipline when it came to his goals. His best friend since childhood, Jamal Pierce, shared stories of how Michael would wake up at 5 a.m. to practice shooting hoops before school, often convincing Jamal to join him despite his protests about the early hour. He used to tell me, while others are sleeping, we're improving, and he truly lived by that, Jamal recalled, fighting back tears at the funeral service attended by hundreds of community members. Michael's girlfriend of 2 years, Brianna Lopez, spoke of his gentleness and his plans for their future together, dreams that included college, professional basketball, if possible, and eventually returning to their community to coach and mentor other young athletes looking for a way out. The tragic irony of Michael's death was that despite his efforts to avoid gang life, it found him anyway in the form of an 11-year-old assassin who likely knew nothing about Michael beyond his tenuous association with a rival gang. According to police reports, Michael had been at Balboa Park that day to meet with his basketball mentor, a former college player who volunteered time helping promising local athletes refine their skills. The meeting location, a bench near the basketball courts, was one Michiel had used many times before without incident, unaware that it sat on what gang members considered a contested boundary. Text messages recovered from Michael's phone showed him confirming the meeting just 30 minutes before the shooting. His last communication a casual "see you in 10" sent to his mentor, who arrived at the park to find emergency vehicles and a crime scene instead of his protege. Michael's funeral drew over 1,000 mourners, including his entire basketball team, teachers, and students from San Diego High School, as well as representatives from several colleges that had been recruiting him. The service was marked by both profound grief and palpable anger, grief for the promising young life cut short, and anger at the senselessness of his death at the hands of a child who had been weaponized by adults with territorial agendas. His basketball jersey, number 23, was retired during an emotional ceremony at his school, where the principal announced the establishment of the Michiel Turpin Scholarship Fund for student athletes demonstrating the same commitment to excellence that had defined Michiel's short life. We cannot bring Michiel back, but we can ensure that his spirit of determination and his dream of education continue through others, the principal stated as Michael's mother was presented with a framed jersey identical to the one that would hang permanently in the school gymnasium. In the weeks following the murder, Michael's family had to endure not only their grief, but also attempts by some to paint Michael as somehow complicit in his own death due to the neighborhood he came from and his family's peripheral gang connections. These characterizations were swiftly countered by the overwhelming evidence of Michiel's positive choices, his academic record, his athletic achievements, and the testimonials of teachers and coaches who had watched him deliberately chart a course away from the influences that claimed many of his peers. "My son was never in a gang," Tasha Turpin stated firmly at a press conference, her voice breaking but resolute. "He was killed because of where he lived and who some of his family knew, not for anything he did. He was working so hard to build a different life." The basketball courts at San Diego High School became an unofficial memorial site, with students, friends, and community members leaving flowers, candles, basketball shoes, and written messages for Michael. Late into the night, the sound of basketballs bouncing could be heard as young players came to shoot hoops in his honor, many wearing shirts with his number or phrases like "Long live Michael" printed on them. A mural of Michael in his basketball uniform was painted on a wall facing the courts, his smile bright against the backdrop of a sunset-colored sky with the words "Dreams don't die" arched above his image. The artist, a former gang member turned community activist, explained that he wanted to create a daily reminder of the potential that exists in every young person, potential that should be nurtured rather than extinguished. What made Michael's death all the more tragic was the revelation that he had recently begun mentoring younger children at a local community center, teaching basic basketball skills while emphasizing the importance of education. He understood that his influence as a successful athlete gave him a platform to reach kids who might otherwise be recruited by gangs, explained the center's director, Maria Gonzalez. He would tell them, "The same discipline that makes you better at sports will make you better at life," and they listened because they respected what he had achieved. Many of these young mentees attended his funeral, clutching small basketballs signed with messages to their coach, their faces reflecting confusion about how someone so strong, so full of life and possibility, could suddenly be gone. The bitter irony that Michael was killed by a child not much older than those he mentored was lost on no one. The 911 calls began flooding the San Diego Police Department Dispatch Center at 2:17 p.m. with panicked visitors to Balboa Park, reporting gunshots and a young man down near the basketball courts. "There's blood everywhere, please hurry," one caller pleaded, her voice shaking as she described trying to comfort Michael Turpin in his final moments, while keeping her own children from witnessing the gruesome scene. First responders arrived within 4 minutes to find Michael already deceased, a single gunshot wound to his chest having caused catastrophic damage to his heart and lungs. The sunny afternoon that had drawn hundreds of families to the park had transformed into chaos, with parents shielding their children's eyes as they hurried toward the exits, and police officers establishing a perimeter around the crime scene that would grow to encompass nearly a quarter-acre of the park. Detective Ryan Thomas, a 15-year veteran of the San Diego Police Department's homicide unit with extensive experience in gang-related crimes, arrived 20 minutes after the initial call, immediately noting the brazen public nature of the killing and recognizing it as potentially gang-related from the location and execution-style shooting. "The first thing that struck me was how crowded this place would have been," Detective Thomas would later testify. "Whoever did this either didn't care about witnesses or wanted the message to be public and unmistakable." The crime scene presented immediate challenges for investigators, as the open-air setting in a heavily trafficked park meant that physical evidence could be easily contaminated or lost amid the hundreds of footprints, discarded items, and natural debris that covered the area. Crime scene technicians methodically photographed and cataloged the scene, placing numbered markers beside potential evidence, while detectives began the task of separating and interviewing dozens of witnesses whose accounts would vary widely given the chaos and trauma of the moment. Several park visitors reported seeing a small boy approaching Michael shortly before the shooting, but initial descriptions were inconsistent regarding the child's appearance beyond his small stature and light complexion. As the body was carefully examined before transport to the medical examiner's office, Detective Thomas noticed an unusual blood spatter pattern that didn't conform to what would typically be expected from a single gunshot wound to the chest. There was a distinctive void pattern in the blood spatter on the bench behind the victim, he noted in his initial report. It suggested that someone had been standing very close to Michael when he was shot, close enough to interrupt the blood spray pattern, and that person would almost certainly have been covered with significant blood spatter themselves. This observation would prove crucial as investigators began piecing together the events that led to Michael Turpin's death, and it provided the first concrete physical evidence that might lead to the shooter beyond eyewitness accounts. Crime scene technicians took extensive samples from the bench and surrounding area, carefully documenting the spatter patterns that would later be analyzed by forensic experts. The murder weapon was not found at the scene, despite an extensive search of trash bins, bushes, and waterways within a half-mile radius of the crime scene. This suggested that the shooter had maintained enough composure to leave with the gun rather than discarding it in panic, another unusual element that pointed to a level of planning not typically associated with juvenile offenders. Whoever did this came prepared to shoot and prepared to get away with it, Detective Thomas told his team as they expanded their search. We're looking for someone who understood enough about evidence to know they should take the gun with them. The caliber of the bullet recovered from Michael's body during the autopsy was identified as 9 millimeters, a common round that would be difficult to trace without the weapon itself, further complicating the investigation in its early stages. While the forensic team continued processing the physical evidence, detectives began reviewing security camera footage from the numerous museums, cafes, and facilities scattered throughout Balboa Park. The shooting itself had not been captured on video, but cameras at the Natural History Museum entrance, approximately 100 yards from the crime scene, provided valuable footage of people entering and exiting the park around the time of the murder. It was during this review process that investigators got their first clear look at a small boy entering the park wearing a distinctive blue and white striped polo shirt and khaki shorts, carrying a Spider-Man backpack that seemed bulkier than would be expected for a child visiting a park. "We need to identify this kid," Detective Thomas instructed his team after viewing the footage. "He enters at 1:55 p.m. and leaves at 2:23 p.m., which puts him in the park during our shooting window, and his exit path would take him right past our crime scene." Forensic analysis of the blood spatter patterns revealed several crucial details that would shape the investigation's direction. First, the void in the spatter pattern indicated that the shooter had been standing approximately 2 feet from Michiel when the gun was fired, suggesting this was an execution rather than a confrontation that escalated. Second, given the angle of the entry wound and the resulting spatter, the shooter was likely significantly shorter than the victim, a detail that aligned with witness descriptions of a child approaching Michiel. Finally, and most importantly, the spatter analysis indicated that the shooter would have been covered with a fine mist of blood droplets, particularly on their front torso and possibly their face and arms, a detail that Detective Thomas knew would be crucial in identifying a suspect. "We need to be looking for someone who came home with unexplained stains on their clothing," he told his team, "or someone who suddenly needed to wash clothes that afternoon." The first significant break in the case came when detectives canvassed businesses along the most likely exit routes from the park, obtaining additional security footage from a convenience store 3 blocks from the park entrance. The grainy video showed a small boy matching the description of the child from the park footage entering the store at approximately 2:30 p.m., purchasing a soda and leaving. The footage quality was poor, but it provided enough detail of the child's distinctive clothing to confirm it was likely the same individual. And more importantly, it captured a partial view of the store's parking lot where the boy appeared to enter a dark-colored sedan. Though the license plate wasn't visible, this suggested that unlike most children his age, this boy had arranged transportation rather than walking home or taking public transit, another unusual element that pointed to planning and possibly adult involvement. While the technical aspects of the investigation progressed, Detective Thomas also began exploring the gang territory angle, knowing that the location of the shooting wasn't random. Balboa Park has been contested ground between the East Side Kings and the West Side Locos for about 2 years now, explained Sergeant Maria Diaz of the gang unit, who was brought in to consult on the case. The basketball courts sit right on what they consider the boundary, and there have been 3 non-fatal shootings in that general area in the past 6 months. The victims' family connections to the East Side Kings, though tenuous, provided a potential motive for the shooting, especially given the escalating tensions between the rival gangs in recent months. What puzzled investigators initially, however, was the use of what appeared to be a child soldier, a tactic that hadn't been documented in San Diego's gang conflicts before this incident. As the first day of investigation came to a close, detectives had established a basic timeline of events, identified a potential suspect through security footage, and developed a theory about the motive based on gang territory disputes. What they lacked was the identity of the young shooter and concrete evidence connecting him to the crime beyond circumstantial video footage. That would change the following morning when Detective Thomas made the decision to circulate still images from the security footage to local elementary schools, a move that some on his team questioned as potentially causing panic, but which Thomas defended as necessary given the unusual nature of the suspect. "We have a child who appears to be between 9 and 12 years old as our primary suspect in a murder case," he stated during the morning briefing. "School administrators and teachers are our best hope for identifying this kid before he potentially hurts someone else." The decision to involve schools would prove pivotal, but before those inquiries bore fruit, the forensic team made another significant discovery. Enhanced analysis of the convenience store footage revealed what appeared to be small, dark spots on the front of the child's blue and white striped shirt, spots that weren't visible in the footage of him entering the park. "Those could be blood spatter that soaked through his outer clothing," noted the forensic technician who made the observation. "If we find this kid in that shirt, we might have our smoking gun even without the actual weapon." This detail elevated the urgency of identifying and locating the young suspect, as investigators now had reason to believe physical evidence connecting him to the murder might still exist, but could be destroyed if the child or any adults involved realized its significance. The morning after the shooting, Detective Ryan Thomas stood before 30 grim-faced school administrators from the San Diego Unified School District, distributing still images taken from the security footage. "We're looking for a student who matches this description and may have been absent yesterday afternoon or shown unusual behavior," he explained, watching as the educators examined the photos of a small boy in a blue and white striped polo shirt and khaki shorts. The approach was unusual and controversial, involving schools in a murder investigation, especially one potentially targeting a child so young. But Thomas had secured approval from both his superiors and the district superintendent, given the extraordinary circumstances. The detective had deliberately withheld some details, presenting it as a serious incident requiring identification rather than explicitly stating they were looking for a murder suspect. A tactical decision meant to prevent panic while still conveying urgency. "If this child is in your school, it's crucial we speak with him and his family as soon as possible," Thomas emphasized, providing his direct contact information to each administrator before concluding the somber meeting. Just 3 hours after the school briefing, Thomas's phone rang with a call that would dramatically advance the investigation. "Detective, this is Principal Margaret Chen from Lincoln Elementary School," the caller began, her voice tense with concern. "I think the boy in your photos might be one of our students, Randall Conklin, a 5th grader. Here." Principal Chen explained that Randall had been absent the previous afternoon, with his grandmother calling to sign him out early for what was described as a dental appointment. More tellingly, Randall's teacher had noticed something unusual that morning. The normally quiet but well-dressed boy had come to school wearing clothes that didn't match and seemed unusually withdrawn, flinching when another student accidentally bumped into him during morning lineup. "He's here now if you want to come speak with him," she offered. "But I should tell you, Detective, Randall is only 11 years old." The age confirmation sent a chill through the experienced detective who had investigated hundreds of homicides but never one with a suspect so young. As protocol for interviewing minors required parental consent and presence, Thomas instructed Principal Chen not to alert Randall or take any special actions that might tip him off while he secured the necessary approvals and contacted the boy's parents. "Just confirm his presence every 30 minutes with a casual classroom check," Thomas instructed. "We'll handle this delicately, but we need to move quickly." Within the hour, Detective Thomas had secured an address for the Conklin family and dispatched officers to locate Randall's parents, while he and his partner, Detective Sarah Martinez, headed to Randall's residence with a search warrant, hoping to find the clothing seen in the security footage before it could be destroyed. The Conklin home was located in a modest but well-maintained neighborhood in the North Park area of San Diego, an area not known for gang activity, but close enough to contested territories that influence could easily reach there. No one answered when detectives knocked at the single-story bungalow, allowing them to execute their search warrant without interference. Inside, they found a relatively normal home for a family with a young child. Randall's room decorated with superhero posters, a desk with school materials neatly arranged, gaming equipment, and a closet full of carefully organized clothing. "This kid is meticulous," Detective Martinez observed as they searched the room, noting how Randall's school uniforms were arranged by day of the week. "Look at how everything has its place. That's unusual organization for an 11-year-old. The detectives photographed the room before beginning their systematic search, paying particular attention to the laundry areas of the home where evidence might have been attempted to be destroyed. In the bathroom connected to Randall's bedroom, detectives made their first significant discovery: a damp blue and white striped polo shirt and khaki shorts stuffed into the back of the cabinet under the sink, partially hidden behind cleaning supplies. "The clothes are still wet," Thomas noted, as he carefully placed each item into separate evidence bags. "And look at this. The shirt has been scrubbed with something harsh, maybe bleach, based on the discoloration around the collar and chest." Detective Martinez, examining the bathroom sink and surrounding area, found traces of what appeared to be diluted blood in the drain trap and faint reddish-brown smudges on a hand towel discarded in the hamper. "He tried to clean up in here, not in the main laundry room," she observed. "That suggests he didn't want his parents to know what he was doing." While the clothing was the most significant find, the detectives also discovered a shoebox pushed to the back of Randall's closet shelf that contained items suggesting gang affiliation: a blue bandana, several crude drawings of gang symbols associated with the West Side Locos, and a small notebook with what appeared to be a tally of points next to different activities, some innocuous like tagged wall, and others more disturbing like carried package and lookout duty. The final entry, dated September 23rd, the day of the murder, simply read, "Proved loyalty," with 5 stars drawn next to it. "He was keeping score," Detective Martinez said quietly, flipping through the pages. "Like it was a video game or something." The notebook and other items were carefully cataloged and added to the growing collection of evidence that would connect Randall Conklin to both the murder and the gang-related motive behind it. As the search continued, detectives were notified that officers had located Randall's mother, Rebecca Conklin, at the hospital where she worked as a medical billing specialist. She had reacted with disbelief and anger when informed that her son was being investigated in connection with a homicide, initially refusing to cooperate until officers explained the seriousness of the situation and the evidence already collected. "This is ridiculous," she had reportedly told the officers. "Randall is a child. He gets straight A's. He doesn't even like violent movies. There's been a terrible mistake." She was now on her way to Lincoln Elementary School, where officers would ensure she and Randall were transported to the police station for formal questioning rather than being permitted to return to the home that was still being searched. Back at the Conklin residence, the detectives' attention turned to the Spider-Man backpack visible in the security footage, which they located in Randall's bedroom closet. Unlike the clothing, the backpack showed no signs of having been cleaned or tampered with, and its contents appeared routine for a fifth grader: school books, a lunch container, pencil case, and a water bottle. "The gun isn't here," Detective Thomas confirmed after a thorough search of the bag and the entire house. "Either he passed it off to someone else after the shooting, or it was never stored here to begin with." This missing piece of evidence suggested adult involvement in the crime, as an 11-year-old would have limited ability to independently acquire and dispose of a firearm. The detectives expanded their search to include the garage and garden shed, finding nothing related to the case, but noting that Randall's father, according to family photos displayed in the home, did not appear to live at the residence. While the physical search continued, a background investigation into the Conklin family revealed several concerning connections. Randall's parents had divorced 3 years earlier, with his father, Daniel Conklin, now living in another part of San Diego. Records showed Daniel Conklin had 2 prior arrests for drug possession, and more significantly was the cousin of Jason J. Rock Sullivan, a known high-ranking member of the West Side Locos, currently serving time for assault and weapon charges. This family connection provided the first tangible link between Randall and the gang suspected of orchestrating the park shooting, suggesting that Randall's involvement might have been facilitated through his father's family ties, rather than through traditional recruitment channels that would typically target older youth. By mid-afternoon, all the collected evidence had been transported to the crime lab, with the clothing items receiving priority processing for blood evidence. Detective Thomas, now at the police station preparing for Randall's interview, received the preliminary report he had been waiting for. Luminol testing on the blue and white striped shirt had revealed extensive blood spatter patterns consistent with standing within close range of a gunshot victim, patterns that had survived Randall's attempt to wash them away. The blood pattern on the shirt matches the void pattern at the crime scene, the forensic technician confirmed over the phone, and we've got enough for DNA testing to confirm if it's the victim's blood, though those results will take longer. This evidence, combined with the security footage and items found in Randall's room, provided enough probable cause for detectives to move forward with formal questioning with an eye toward charges, even given the suspect's extremely young age. At 4:15 p.m., Randall Conklin arrived at the San Diego Police Department's Central Division, accompanied by his visibly distraught mother and 2 officers who had transported them from the school. The small boy, dwarfed by the adult-sized chair in the interview room, showed little emotion as Detective Thomas explained the special procedures required for interviewing a juvenile, including the presence of his mother and the recording of the entire conversation. A court-appointed attorney had also been arranged, given the seriousness of the potential charges, though Randall's mother insisted there must be a misunderstanding. "My son is 11 years old," she repeated, her voice strained but determined. "He couldn't possibly have done what you're suggesting." Randall himself remained silent throughout these preliminaries, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him, his expression unreadable in a way that Detective Thomas found unusually composed for a child in such circumstances. The investigation had moved with remarkable speed, transforming from a shooting with an unknown perpetrator to a case with a prime suspect in less than 24 hours. As detectives prepared to question Randall Conklin, They faced not only the technical challenges of interviewing a child about a capital crime, but also the profound ethical and psychological questions raised by a case involving an 11-year-old suspected of premeditated murder. The evidence collected from the Conklin home, particularly the blood-spattered clothing that Randall had attempted to wash clean, provided a strong physical connection to the crime scene. The gang-related items discovered in his room, combined with the family connection to the West Side Locos through his father's cousin, established a plausible motive tied to the territorial dispute. What remained to be understood was how and why a child still young enough to carry a Spider-Man backpack had become involved in a gang execution, and whether he had acted alone or been directed by adults who had calculated that his age might shield him from the most severe consequences of the crime. The luminol-treated shirt glowed an eerie blue under the specialized lighting in the forensic lab, revealing a constellation of blood spatter that told the story of Michael Turpin's final moments. "This is what we call high-velocity spatter," explained Dr. Eleanor Chang, the San Diego Police Department's lead forensic analyst, pointing to the distinctive pattern that covered the front of Randall Conklin's blue and white striped polo shirt. When a bullet enters a body, especially with a shot to the chest where it hits major blood vessels, it creates a fine mist of blood that travels outward at high velocity, covering anything or anyone within a certain radius. The pattern on Randall's shirt was consistent with someone standing approximately 2 feet in front of the victim when the shot was fired, placing him at the exact distance witnesses had described seeing a small boy standing from Michael Turpin just before the gunshot rang out. Dr. Chang's preliminary report indicated that despite Randall's attempt to wash the shirt, the blood proteins had bonded with the fabric fibers in a way that made complete removal virtually impossible without destroying the garment itself. DNA analysis confirmed what investigators had already suspected. The blood on Randall's clothing belonged to Michael Turpin, creating an irrefutable link between the 11-year-old and the murder scene. The statistical probability of this being anyone's blood other than Michael Turpin's is less than 1 in 1 trillion, Dr. Chang stated in her formal report, which was delivered to Detective Ryan Thomas exactly 1 week after the shooting. This scientific confirmation strengthened what was already becoming an unusually solid case against a juvenile suspect, bolstered further by security footage, witness statements, and the incriminating items found in Randall's bedroom. The most damning physical evidence, however, remained the shirt itself, with its pattern of blood spatter telling a story that contradicted any possibility of Randall being an innocent bystander who had simply been near the victim when someone else fired the fatal shot. While the forensic team continued processing the physical evidence, Detective Thomas and his partner focused on establishing the connection between Randall Conklin and the West Side Locos gang, particularly through his father's family. Interviews with Daniel Conklin, Randall's father, initially yielded denials of any ongoing gang affiliation, though he admitted his cousin Jason Sullivan was a high-ranking member currently incarcerated. "I kept Randall away from that side of the family," Daniel insisted during his second interview, his nervousness evident in his shifting gaze and fidgeting hands. "Rebecca and I agreed that was one of our rules even after the divorce, no contact with Jason or his crowd." Yet cell phone records told a different story, revealing numerous calls between Daniel Conklin and known West Side Locos members in the weeks leading up to the shooting, including 3 calls on the morning of the murder itself, followed by a complete cessation of contact immediately after. The most revealing breakthrough in establishing the gang connection came from Randall's own possessions, specifically the notebook found in his bedroom with its point-based tracking system for various activities. Detectives consulted with Dr. Manuel Ortiz, a criminologist specializing in juvenile gang recruitment, who identified the notebook as an example of a technique increasingly used to indoctrinate younger children into gang activities. It's modeled after video game achievement systems, Dr. Ortiz explained, examining the notebook's entries. These kids are being given missions with point values, creating a gamified path toward gang membership that appeals to children who've grown up with digital reward systems. The progression is deliberate, starting with minor vandalism, moving to serving as lookouts, then carrying packages, which are likely drugs, and culminating in this final mission marked proved loyalty, almost certainly the shooting itself. The investigation into Randall's school life revealed a child who existed in two completely separate worlds. His teachers described him as quiet, academically gifted, and well-behaved, with no disciplinary issues and consistently high grades across all subjects. He was the last student I would ever suspect of something like this, his fifth-grade teacher, Ms. Heather Phillips, told detectives during her interview. Randall completed all his assignments, participated appropriately in class, and seemed to have normal social interactions with his peers. Yet this perception stood in stark contrast to what investigators discovered about his after-school life, where security camera footage from various locations throughout the city showed Randall in the company of older teens known to be affiliated with the West Side Locos, particularly in the months leading up to the shooting. This dual existence, model student by day, gang affiliate by evening, had gone completely unnoticed by both school officials and his mother, who worked evening shifts at the hospital 3 days a week, during which time Randall was supposedly supervised by his grandmother. Randall's grandmother, Elaine Conklin, proved to be a crucial witness, though not entirely by choice or cooperation. Initially claiming she had taken Randall to a dental appointment on the day of the murder, she eventually admitted under persistent questioning that she had been instructed to provide this cover story by Daniel Conklin. He called and said Randall needed to be picked up from school for a special task, that it was important for the family, she reluctantly explained, her hands trembling as she gave her statement. I didn't ask questions because Daniel said it was better if I didn't know, and I've learned that's usually true with him. She had signed Randall out of school as requested, then dropped him off at a convenience store where he was met by an older teenager she didn't recognize, believing he would be returned home afterward. When I saw the news about that poor boy in the park, it never occurred to me that Randall could be involved, she insisted. Though detectives noted she had made no effort to come forward with this information until confronted with evidence that contradicted her initial story. The territorial nature of the motive became clearer as investigators mapped the recent escalation in tensions between the East Side Kings and the West Side Locos. Balboa Park, with its high-foot traffic and numerous isolated areas, had become valuable territory for drug sales, with each gang claiming different sections and violently defending their boundaries. 3 weeks before Michael Turpin's murder, a 16-year-old West Side Locos member had been severely beaten near the same basketball courts where Michael was shot, reportedly by East Side Kings affiliates who claimed he was selling on their turf. 2 days later, the home of a known East Side Kings member had been vandalized with West Side Locos graffiti, and a car belonging to another member had been set on fire. This was a calculated escalation, explained Sergeant Diaz of the gang unit, each incident becoming more serious, leading up to what appears to be a planned execution designed to send the most shocking message possible, using a child as the shooter specifically because it would generate maximum publicity and fear. The investigation also revealed why Michael Turpin had been selected as the target despite his limited gang involvement. His status as a successful student-athlete made him a visible symbol of the East Side Kings territory, even though he himself was actively avoiding gang activities. By taking out someone like Michael, who represented the best of what could come from that neighborhood, the West Side Locos weren't just eliminating a rival. They were sending a message that no one was untouchable, Sergeant Diaz explained during a case briefing. Text messages recovered from the phones of several Westside Locos members included discussions about hitting them where it hurts and taking down their golden boy. Though no messages explicitly named Michael or detailed the plan to use Randall as the shooter. This careful compartmentalization of information suggested sophisticated planning designed to shield higher-ranking members from direct connection to the murder, using Randall, who had no prior record and whose juvenile status would typically result in more lenient treatment, as the triggerman. The weapon used in the shooting remained elusive, with no gun recovered, despite extensive searches and monitoring of known Westside Locos weapon suppliers. The bullet recovered from Michael Turpin's body was identified as being fired from a 9mm semi-automatic pistol, likely a Glock, based on the rifling marks, but without the weapon itself, this evidence remained circumstantial. However, a significant break came when officers monitoring social media accounts associated with Westside Locos members discovered a private message sent 2 days after the murder that referenced the little soldier's toy being melted down and scattered in the bay. This suggested that the gang had permanently disposed of the weapon, recognizing its evidential value, and further indicated that adults had been involved in the planning and cover-up stages of the crime, even if Randall had pulled the trigger himself. While physical evidence and gang connections strengthened the case, prosecutors faced unprecedented questions about how to proceed legally against such a young defendant. California law permitted children as young as 14 to be tried as adults for murder under certain circumstances, but at 11, Randall fell well below this threshold. "We're in uncharted territory here," admitted Senior Deputy District Attorney Emily Davis, who had been assigned to the case due to her experience with both gang prosecutions and juvenile defendants. "The evidence clearly points to premeditated murder, but we're dealing with a defendant whose age makes traditional prosecution problematic." The district attorney's office began consulting with legal experts across the country, examining the few precedents that existed for cases involving extremely young killers while weighing various approaches that would balance justice for the victim with recognition of the defendant's age and the likely manipulation by adults who had exploited his youth. 2 weeks into the investigation, detectives finally obtained the last piece of evidence they had been seeking: direct proof of Randall's recruitment and instruction by adult gang members. A search warrant for Daniel Conklin's apartment, based on the suspicious pattern of phone calls surrounding the day of the murder, yielded a prepaid cell phone hidden inside a hollowed-out book. The phone contained text messages between Daniel and his cousin Jason Sullivan, sent through an intermediary, as Sullivan was incarcerated, discussing Randall's initiation and referring to the child as "our perfect soldier," because no one suspects a kid that young. Most damning was a message sent the day before the shooting that included a photo of Michael Turpin with the text, "Show this to the little man. Tell him this is the target. East Side Courts, 2 p.m. This evidence completed the picture of exploitation and manipulation that had led an 11-year-old to commit murder, providing a critical context that would influence how the case moved forward in the justice system. As the investigation neared its conclusion, the case against Randall Conklin had grown from initial shock and disbelief to a comprehensive body of evidence that left little doubt about his direct involvement in Michael Turpin's murder. The luminol revealed blood spatter on his clothing, the security footage placing him at the scene, the notebook documenting his gang achievements, and the text messages showing how he had been deliberately groomed and directed by adults created an unusually complete case. Yet the most disturbing aspect remained the calculated exploitation of a child too young to fully comprehend the permanence of his actions or to resist the influence of adults he trusted, particularly his father. As Detective Thomas prepared his final report, he included a personal note that would later be quoted during the legal proceedings. This investigation has revealed not one, but two victims, Michael Turpin, whose promising life was ended by violence, and Randall Conklin, whose childhood was weaponized by adults who should have protected him instead of pushing him toward an act that has destroyed multiple lives, including his own. The arrest of 11-year-old Randall Conklin at Lincoln Elementary School sent shockwaves through San Diego, with news helicopters hovering above the campus and parents rushing to collect their children as word spread that a fifth grader had been taken into custody for murder. Detective Ryan Thomas had deliberately arranged for the arrest to occur after school hours to minimize the spectacle and protect other students, but someone, likely a staff member, had tipped off the media, resulting in the very circus Thomas had hoped to avoid. Officers led Randall from the building in handcuffs that looked absurdly large on his small wrists, a blue windbreaker draped over his arms to partially shield him from cameras as they guided him toward an unmarked police car. The boy's face remained expressionless throughout the process, his eyes fixed straight ahead, displaying none of the fear or confusion that might be expected from a child in such circumstances. He looked like he was walking to the principal's office, not being arrested for murder, one officer later remarked, disturbed by Randall's apparent detachment from the gravity of the situation. At the San Diego Police Department's Juvenile Division, Randall was processed according to the specialized protocols for underage suspects, his small fingers pressed against the scanner for fingerprinting, his height measured at just 4 feet 9 inches on the wall chart designed for adult offenders. His mother, Rebecca Conklin, waited in the interview room, her face pale and drawn from days of questioning and the gradual horrifying realization that her son was indeed involved in a gang execution. Randall's court-appointed attorney, Maria Vasquez, a veteran juvenile defender with 20 years' experience, stood nearby watching the process with a grim expression that reflected the unprecedented nature of the case before her. "I need time alone with my client before any questioning," she informed Detective Thomas, who nodded his agreement, having expected this request and knowing that every procedural rule would need to be followed meticulously for a case involving a defendant so young. "Take whatever time you need," Thomas replied, "but he's going to have to talk to us eventually." When Randall finally entered the interview room, the recording equipment already activated according to department policy for juvenile interrogations, he sat perfectly straight in the chair across from Detective Thomas and his partner, his hands folded neatly on the table in front of him. The rehearsed quality of his posture and the calculated blankness of his expression struck Thomas immediately. This was not the spontaneous behavior of a typical 11-year-old, but something that appeared practiced and deliberate. "Randall, do you understand why you're here today?" Thomas began, keeping his tone conversational rather than confrontational, aware of the complex psychology involved in interviewing a child suspect. Randall nodded once, a short, mechanical gesture, but remained silent, his eyes now fixed on a point just above the detective's shoulder, avoiding direct eye contact in a way that seemed strategic rather than fearful. "I need you to answer out loud for the recording," Thomas prompted gently, receiving a barely audible yes in response. The initial phase of the interview focused on establishing Randall's understanding of basic concepts: truth versus lies, right versus wrong, the consequences of actions. A standard approach when dealing with very young suspects whose cognitive and moral development might be questioned in court. Randall answered these preliminary questions with monosyllabic responses, demonstrating an intellectual grasp of the concepts while displaying no emotional connection to them. "If you take something that belongs to someone else, that's stealing, and stealing is wrong," he stated flatly when asked to provide an example of understanding right and wrong, the textbook perfect answer, delivered with a robotic quality that troubled both detectives. His attorney occasionally interjected to ensure questions remained age-appropriate, though she too seemed disturbed by her client's unusual demeanor, whispering at one point to Rebecca Conklin, who wiped tears from her eyes as she watched her son respond like a programmed automaton rather than a child. After establishing the groundwork, Detective Thomas shifted the focus to the day of the shooting, carefully navigating toward the central events while avoiding leading questions that might later be challenged in court. "Randall, can you tell me about leaving school early on Monday, September 23rd? He asked, keeping his tone neutral. Randall glanced briefly at his attorney, who nodded slightly before responding with a rehearsed-sounding account of being picked up by his grandmother for a dental appointment, directly contradicting what his grandmother had already admitted in her own statement. When gently confronted with this discrepancy, Randall simply repeated the same story with identical wording, a behavior pattern that Dr. Catherine Reynolds, the forensic psychologist, observing the interview through a one-way mirror, noted as consistent with a child who had been coached on what to say but not prepared for follow-up questions or contradictory evidence. As the interview approached the 2-hour mark, Detective Thomas made the strategic decision to confront Randall with the physical evidence, particularly the luminol-revealed blood on his clothing. "Randall, we found the shirt you were wearing that day," he said, sliding a photograph of the luminol-treated garment across the table, the eerie blue glow of the revealed blood spatter clearly visible in the image. "This is your shirt, and these blue areas show blood that couldn't be washed away, Michael Turpin's blood." For the first time since the interview began, Randall's carefully maintained facade cracked slightly, his eyes widened almost imperceptibly, and his right hand twitched before he could control it. "The luminol test doesn't lie, Randall," Thomas continued, his voice still calm but more direct now. "It shows us what you tried to wash away. I need you to tell me how Michael's blood got on your shirt." The silence that followed lasted nearly a full minute, broken only by the sound of Rebecca Conklin's muffled sobbing as she confronted the irrefutable evidence of her son's involvement. Randall stared at the photograph, his composure visibly fracturing for a brief moment, before he seemed to mentally retreat, pulling his emotions back behind the wall he had constructed. "I want to talk to my dad," he finally said, the first unprompted statement he had made during the entire interview. "I need to ask him what to do." This request, revealing both his continued dependence on his father's guidance and suggesting Daniel Conklin's involvement in the crime, provided investigators with a critical insight into the power dynamics at play. Randall's attorney immediately called for a break, recognizing the potential implications of her client's request, while Detective Thomas nodded slowly, having gained the confirmation he had been seeking about who had been directing Randall's actions. When the interview resumed after a 30-minute break, during which Randall spoke privately with his attorney while refusing to interact with his visibly distraught mother, Detective Thomas took a different approach. "Randall, we know about the notebook in your room," he began, placing photographs of the pages documenting Randall's missions and point system on the table. "We know about the phone calls between your dad and other Westside Locos members. We know you were given a mission to prove your loyalty, and we know exactly who gave you that mission." Thomas paused, allowing the weight of these statements to register. "What we don't understand is why a smart kid like you with good grades and no trouble at school would agree to hurt someone you didn't even know." This question, focused not on whether Randall had committed the act, but on his motivation, seemed to penetrate the boy's defenses in a way previous approaches had not. His eyes flickered momentarily to his mother, then back to the detective, a flash of genuine emotion, confusion, perhaps, or uncertainty, crossing his face before he regained control. "The park belongs to us," he finally said, his voice quiet but suddenly more childlike than at any previous point in the interview. "That's what they told me." Mikhail was on the wrong side. He was wearing the wrong colors in our territory. The statement was delivered with the simplified logic of a child repeating an adult's justification, the territorial gang concept, reduced to its most basic elements in a way that highlighted Randall's limited understanding of the true implications of what he had done. Dad said I needed to be a soldier, that I had to protect our territory because no one would expect someone like me. He said I'd be a hero to the set. The mention of his father as the direct instigator prompted Rebecca Conklin to cry out, "Daniel put you up to this? He gave you a gun?" Her voice breaking with horror and rage at her ex-husband's manipulation of their child. Randall flinched at his mother's outburst, but didn't look at her, instead maintaining eye contact with Detective Thomas as he continued with increasing animation, as though a dam had broken. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal. Dad said the gun wouldn't be traced to me, that I just had to walk up, do it fast, and walk away normal, not run. He said because I'm a kid, nothing bad would happen even if I got caught. He said I'd go to juvie for a year, maybe 2, and come out respected by everyone. The childish naivety of believing these assurances contrasted sharply with the cold calculation he had displayed during and after the shooting, revealing the fundamental disconnect between Randall's actions and his understanding of their consequences. As Randall continued talking, a clearer picture emerged of how an 11-year-old had been systematically groomed for violence, beginning with small missions like vandalism, and gradually escalating to more serious gang activities, all framed as achievements in a game-like progression. Each mission had points, he explained, pointing to his notebook in the photographs. If you get enough points, you level up. I was trying to get to level 3, because that's when you get your own tag and can wear the colors all the time, not just at meetings. The calculated exploitation of a child's psychology using familiar gaming concepts to normalize criminal behavior was evident in every aspect of Randall's description, from the reward system to the language used by the adults who had manipulated him. They called me Little Soldier and said I was special because I could go places and do things the older guys couldn't without getting stopped by police. The interrogation took a particularly disturbing turn when Detective Martinez asked about the shooting itself, specifically whether Randall had understood that Michael would die. "Dad said it wasn't really like killing someone in real life," Randall replied, with a troubling lack of affect. "He said it was more like in a game where you're just taking out an enemy character, and that Michael was a bad guy because he was from the wrong side." This deliberate blurring of reality and video game violence, exploiting an 11-year-old's still developing concept of death's permanence, revealed the extent to which Randall had been psychologically manipulated. When asked if he now understood that Michael was permanently gone and wouldn't respawn like a game character, Randall hesitated before answering, "I guess so," his uncertainty suggesting he still hadn't fully processed the irreversible reality of what he had done. Throughout the remainder of the interview, Randall provided detailed information about the planning and execution of the murder, from being shown Michael's photograph the day before to receiving the gun, which he described as smaller than the ones in movies. Just before approaching the park, to being instructed exactly where to aim and how close to stand. He described being picked up afterward by an older teen he knew only as Ricky, who took the gun from him immediately and drove him to the convenience store where he purchased a soda because Dad said to act normal and do something regular people would do. The level of adult orchestration became increasingly apparent with each new detail, painting a picture of adults who had meticulously planned a murder, using a child as their weapon, exploiting his trust, his desire for approval, and his limited understanding of consequences. As the interrogation approached its 5th hour, Randall began showing signs of fatigue, his responses becoming shorter and less coherent, as the emotional and physical strain of the situation finally began to overcome his conditioned composure. His attorney requested the interview be concluded, a motion Detective Thomas did not oppose, having obtained more than enough information to proceed with charges against Randall and to justify additional arrests of the adults involved in planning and facilitating the shooting. Before ending the session, Thomas asked one final question, one that had been troubling him throughout the investigation. "Randall, after you shot Michael, how did you feel?" The boy's answer came after a long pause, his voice barely audible as he looked down at his hands for the first time since the interview began. "I didn't feel anything," he said. "I thought I would feel different, like leveling up in a game, but I just felt the same. I kept waiting to feel something, but nothing came." This final statement, perhaps more than any other aspect of the case, encapsulated the tragedy at its core. A child who had been so thoroughly manipulated and emotionally stunted by the adults in his life that even taking another person's life failed to break through the detachment they had cultivated in him. As Randall was led from the interview room to the juvenile detention facility, where he would await his initial court appearance, Detective Thomas was left with the disturbing image of a small boy who had been transformed into a weapon, aimed, fired, and then discarded by the very people who should have protected him from such exploitation. The case would proceed toward prosecution with an overwhelming body of evidence, including Randall's own confession. But the question of justice in a situation where the primary perpetrator was himself, in many ways a victim, remained complex and troubling for everyone involved in the investigation. The San Diego County Courthouse stood imposing against the clear blue California sky, its classical facade a stark contrast to the thoroughly modern media spectacle unfolding on its steps. Television crews from national networks jostled for position alongside local reporters, all seeking the perfect angle to capture the arrival of the most controversial defendant to face trial in the city's recent history, 11-year-old Randall Conklin. Court cases involving juvenile defendants typically proceeded with strict privacy protections closed to the public and the press. But the unprecedented nature of this case, a premeditated gang execution carried out by an elementary school student, had led to a partial waiver of these protections following intense legal battles. While cameras would not be permitted inside the courtroom, and Randall's face would be shielded from photographers during his transfers to and from the courthouse, the substance of the proceedings would be reported to a public that remained divided over whether an 11-year-old should face adult consequences for a crime that had clearly been orchestrated by adults. Inside Courtroom 3B, specially selected for its smaller size and more intimate atmosphere, Randall Conklin appeared almost lost in the defendant's chair, his feet barely touching the ground, his navy blue suit, purchased specifically for the trial, hanging loosely on his small frame despite tailoring. The juvenile court judge, the Honorable Eleanor Martinez, a 30-year veteran of the bench with extensive experience in cases involving children, had made several accommodations for the defendant's age, allowing his mother to sit closer than typically permitted, mandating shorter sessions with frequent breaks, and instructing all parties to use simplified language when possible. Yet, despite these concessions to his youth, the charges Randall faced were anything but childish. First-degree murder with special circumstances related to gang activity, charges that would have carried the possibility of the death penalty for an adult defendant in California at that time. Due to his age, Randall could not legally be sentenced to death or even life without parole regardless of the verdict, but he still faced the possibility of remaining in custody until well into adulthood, if convicted. The evidence will show that on September 23, 2019, the defendant, Randall Conklin, committed a premeditated execution in broad daylight, shooting Mikhail Turpin at point-blank range in Balboa Park. Senior Deputy District Attorney Emily Davis began in her opening statement, her voice measured but firm, as she addressed the 12 jurors and 4 alternates who had been selected after an exhaustive 2-week process. You will hear how the defendant attempted to wash the victim's blood from his clothing, how he maintained a notebook documenting his gang activities, and how he confessed to police that he understood he was ending Michael Turpin's life over a territorial dispute. Davis, known for her methodical approach to gang prosecutions, had been carefully selected for this unprecedented case, her experience with both juvenile defendants and gang-related crimes making her uniquely qualified to navigate its complexities. But you will also hear, she continued, how the defendant was systematically manipulated by adults who exploited his youth and vulnerability, who framed murder as a mission in a video game, and who selected him specifically because they believed his age would shield him and them from justice. This dual narrative, presenting Randall as both perpetrator and victim, formed the unusual backbone of the prosecution's approach, reflecting the extraordinary circumstances of the case and the ethical quandaries it presented. Davis had made the strategic decision to acknowledge the exploitation while still holding Randall accountable for his actions, a balanced approach that reflected the prosecution's understanding of the public's conflicted feelings about trying such a young defendant. This is not a case about whether adults manipulated this child. The evidence will clearly show they did, Davis explained to the jury. This is a case about whether, despite that manipulation, Randall Conklin understood the wrongfulness of his actions when he pointed a gun at Michael Turpin and pulled the trigger, taking the life of a young man who had dreams of college and a basketball career. Defense attorney Maria Vasquez approached her opening statement with equal care, her extensive experience with juvenile cases evident in how she positioned Randall physically before addressing the jury, having him sit on a cushion that allowed him to be more visible above the table, a subtle reminder of his small stature and youth. What the prosecution has described is a tragedy, one that took the life of Michael Turpin and destroyed the childhood of Randall Conklin, she began, her tone somber but resolute. But this tragedy was engineered by adults who deliberately exploited a child whose brain is scientifically incapable of fully understanding consequences or resisting the influence of authority figures. Vasquez intended to pursue a defense centered on diminished capacity and coercion, arguing that Randall's age and the systematic manipulation he had endured rendered him unable to form the mental state required for first-degree murder, regardless of his actions on the day of the shooting. The evidence will show that Randall's father and other adult gang members specifically selected him because they knew he was developmentally incapable of fully comprehending the permanence of death or morally understanding the full wrongfulness of taking a human life. Vasquez continued, gesturing toward a large diagram of the developmental stages of the juvenile brain that had been prepared for the jury. You will hear from expert witnesses who will explain that children of Randall's age still believe in monsters under the bed, still expect dead pets to somehow return, and are neurologically wired to obey adults they trust without question. These adults didn't just give Randall a gun, they deliberately warped his reality, exploiting cognitive limitations that exist in every child his age. The jury, a diverse group that the selection process had carefully screened for any biases regarding juvenile defendants or gang violence, listened intently to both opening statements, their expressions revealing the difficult moral and legal questions they would be wrestling with throughout the trial. Several jurors glanced at Randall during the proceedings, their faces showing the natural human response of seeing a child in such circumstances: confusion, sympathy, disturbance at the incongruity of his youth and the charges he faced. Randall himself remained largely expressionless throughout, occasionally whispering to his attorney, but otherwise sitting perfectly still, his face a mask of control that seemed both inappropriate for his age and consistent with the psychological conditioning described by both the prosecution and defense. As the trial moved from opening statements to the prosecution's case, Emily Davis began methodically building the evidentiary foundation, starting with the crime scene itself. Detective Ryan Thomas was the first witness called, providing the jury with a comprehensive overview of the initial investigation, while crime scene photographs were displayed on a large screen visible to the court, but angled away from spectators to prevent the most graphic images from being seen by the public. Thomas described arriving at Balboa Park to find Michael Turpin already deceased, a single gunshot wound to his chest having caused catastrophic damage to his heart and lungs, resulting in death within minutes, if not seconds. The location was significant, Thomas explained, indicating a map of the park with gang territories marked in different colors. This particular area of the basketball courts sits directly on what these gangs consider a boundary line between West Side Locos and East Side Kings territory. It wasn't a random selection, but a deliberate statement. Thomas then walked the jury through the discovery of the distinctive blood spatter pattern that had first suggested the shooter would have been covered with the victim's blood, displaying photographs of the bench behind Michael that showed the telling void in the spatter pattern. Based on this evidence, we knew we were looking for someone who had been standing approximately 2 feet from Michael when the shot was fired, someone who would have been directly in the path of the blood spatter and almost certainly covered with a fine mist of the victim's blood, Thomas testified, his experienced demeanor providing a steady foundation for the technical aspects of the case. When asked by the prosecution if this blood evidence had led to identifying the defendant, Thomas nodded, explaining how security camera footage had first captured a small boy in distinctive clothing entering and leaving the park during the time frame of the murder, and how this had eventually led investigators to Lincoln Elementary School and Randall Conklin. The testimony then turned to the search of the Conklin residence, with Thomas describing the discovery of the damp blue and white striped polo shirt and khaki shorts hidden under the bathroom sink, clearly having been recently and hurriedly washed. The clothing matched exactly what we had seen on the security footage, Thomas stated, as side-by-side photos were displayed, showing Randall in the footage and the recovered clothing items. But what made these items particularly significant was what we found when we applied luminol testing. At this point in the testimony, the courtroom lighting was dimmed as photographs of the luminol-treated shirt were displayed, showing the eerie blue glow of the revealed blood spatter that Randall had attempted to wash away. This pattern, Thomas explained, indicating the distribution of the glowing spots, is completely consistent with the wearer of this shirt standing directly in front of someone, suffering a gunshot wound to the chest. As compelling as the physical evidence was, it was the discovery of Randall's notebook that seemed to have the strongest impact on the jury, with several members visibly reacting as pages were displayed, showing the childish handwriting documenting gang missions and the point system used to incentivize Randall's increasing involvement in criminal activities. This is essentially grooming through gamification, Thomas explained, using terminology that had been suggested by the forensic psychologists consulted during the investigation. The adults involved created a system that exploited the defendant's familiarity with video game achievement mechanics, turning increasingly serious criminal acts into missions with points and levels that mimicked the reward systems he was accustomed to from gaming. The final entry, dated the day of the murder with its 5 stars and notation of proved loyalty, drew particular attention, with jurors looking back and forth between the notebook page and Randall himself, perhaps trying to reconcile the childish handwriting with the gravity of the act it represented. Throughout Thomas's testimony, Randall remained largely impassive, though attentive observers might have noticed his slight tensing when certain photographs were displayed, particularly those showing his blood-spattered shirt revealed by the luminol testing. His mother, seated in the row directly behind the defense table, as permitted by the judge's special accommodation, periodically wiped tears from her eyes, especially during testimony about how her son had been systematically manipulated during the time she was working evening shifts at the hospital. The jury's attention frequently shifted between Randall, the evidence being presented, and Rebecca Conklin's evident distress, the human elements of the case remaining impossible to ignore despite the technical nature of much of the testimony. Cross-examination by defense attorney Maria Vasquez focused primarily on Randall's age and the extensive adult involvement in planning and facilitating the crime. Detective Thomas, in your 15 years of homicide investigation, have you ever encountered a case where an 11-year-old independently planned and executed a murder without significant adult involvement? She asked, establishing the exceptional nature of the case. Never, Thomas acknowledged. This case is unprecedented, in my experience, both in terms of the defendant's young age and the level of adult manipulation evident in the evidence. Vasquez continued this line of questioning, having Thomas confirm that every piece of evidence, from the gun that Randall could not have legally acquired himself, to the transportation to and from the crime scene, to the notebook documenting the escalating missions, pointed to extensive adult orchestration of the crime, with Randall serving as what Thomas himself had characterized in his report as a weapon, wielded by others rather than an independent actor. As the first day of testimony concluded, Judge Martinez issued strict instructions to the jury about avoiding media coverage of the case, an especially important caution given the national attention it had attracted. The unprecedented nature of trying such a young defendant for a premeditated murder had sparked intense debate among legal experts, child advocates, and the general public, with opinions sharply divided between those who emphasized the deliberate nature of the shooting regardless of the shooter's age, and those who argued that an 11-year-old lacked the neurological development to be held fully accountable for such an act, especially given the evident adult manipulation. These broader societal questions formed the backdrop against which the legal proceedings would unfold, with the jury tasked with applying the law to a situation that pushed at the boundaries of conventional understanding about childhood, culpability, and justice. As Randall was led from the courtroom at the end of that first day, his small form flanked by attorneys and court officers, the fundamental tension at the heart of the case was thrown into sharp relief. How does a justice system designed primarily for adults respond when a child commits an adult crime, especially when that child was deliberately selected and manipulated precisely because of the system's limitations in addressing juvenile offenders? The prosecution had begun building their case on the foundation of irrefutable physical evidence, the blood spatter revealed by luminol, the security footage placing Randall at the scene, the notebook documenting his gang activities while simultaneously acknowledging the exploitation that had led him to that park with a gun in his Spider-Man backpack. The defense had established their counter-narrative of a child incapable of the reasoning and moral understanding necessary for the charges he faced, regardless of his actions on that September day. Between these competing frameworks, 12 jurors would need to determine not just what Randall Conklin had done, but what justice could possibly mean in a case where the line between perpetrator and victim had become so profoundly blurred. Dr. Eleanor Chang, the San Diego Police Department's lead forensic analyst, approached the witness stand with the measured confidence of someone who had testified in hundreds of trials. Yet even her experienced demeanor showed signs of the case's emotional weight as she glanced briefly at Randall Conklin, looking impossibly small in his oversized chair. As the prosecution's key scientific witness, Dr. Chang's testimony would provide the jury with the technical foundation for understanding the blood evidence that formed the cornerstone of the case against the 11-year-old defendant. Blood spatter analysis is essentially the study of blood in motion, she began, after establishing her credentials, which included a Ph.D. in forensic science and 17 years of experience with the department. When blood is acted upon by force, such as the impact of a bullet, it creates distinctive patterns depending on the type of force applied, the distance from the source, and the angle of impact. These patterns tell us a story about what happened during a violent event, often with remarkable precision. Using a series of illustrated diagrams, specially prepared for the jury, Dr. Chang explained the difference between various types of blood spatter, focusing particularly on the high-velocity impact spatter that occurs during gunshot wounds. When a bullet enters the body, especially when it impacts major blood vessels, as it did in this case by striking Michael Turpin's heart, it creates a fine mist of blood that travels outward at high velocity, she explained, indicating the pattern on the diagram. This mist can travel several feet and will coat any object or person in its path with a distinctive pattern of tiny droplets. With the courtroom lights dimmed, Dr. Chang then displayed the photographs of Randall Conklin's blue and white striped polo shirt under luminol testing, the constellation of revealed blood droplets glowing an eerie blue against the fabric. Despite the defendant's attempt to wash this shirt, the blood proteins had bonded with the fabric fibers in a way that made complete removal impossible without destroying the garment itself. Luminol reveals these blood proteins even after washing, allowing us to see what the naked eye cannot. With methodical precision, Dr. Chang walked the jury through her analysis process, explaining how the pattern on Randall's shirt was consistent with someone standing approximately 2 feet in front of the victim when the fatal shot was fired, exactly the position witnesses had described seeing a small boy standing from Michael Turpin just before the shooting. The distribution, density, and size of these droplets creates a unique pattern that tells us precisely where the wearer of this shirt was positioned in relation to the victim, she testified, using side-by-side comparisons of the shirt and crime scene photographs to illustrate the correlation. Furthermore, DNA analysis confirmed with absolute scientific certainty that this blood belonged to Michael Turpin, with a statistical probability of error less than 1 in 1 trillion. This conclusive scientific evidence linking Randall directly to the shooting appeared to have a visible impact on several jurors, who shifted uncomfortably in their seats as they confronted the irrefutable physical connection between the small boy before them and the violent death of a 17-year-old student-athlete. During cross-examination, defense attorney Maria Vasquez did not attempt to challenge the scientific findings themselves, as the evidence was effectively unassailable, but instead focused on what the science could and couldn't tell the jury about Randall's mental state. Dr. Chang, your analysis can tell us that Randall Conklin was standing in front of Michael Turpin when he was shot, and that Michael's blood was on Randall's clothing, Vasquez began. But can your scientific analysis tell us anything about Randall's understanding of the permanence of death at the time of the shooting? Dr. Chang acknowledged it could not. Can your luminol testing reveal whether an 11-year-old brain, which neuroscience tells us is still developing critical areas responsible for impulse control and consequence assessment, was capable of forming the intent required for premeditated murder? Again, Dr. Chang conceded the limitations of forensic science in addressing these questions, limitations that Vasquez would exploit as she built her case around Randall's developmental capacity rather than the physical facts of the shooting itself. Following the forensic testimony, the prosecution called Dr. Manuel Ortiz, a criminologist specializing in juvenile gang recruitment, whose testimony would provide crucial context for understanding how and why Randall had become involved in a gang execution at such a young age. What we're seeing in this case represents an alarming evolution in gang recruitment strategies, Dr. Ortiz explained after establishing his credentials, which included 2 decades of research on youth gang participation. Traditionally, gangs targeted teenagers, 14, 15, 16-year-old, for recruitment. But in recent years, we've observed a deliberate shift toward recruiting much younger children, particularly in areas where juvenile justice systems are perceived as lenient. Dr. Ortiz then displayed a series of charts showing the decreasing age of first gang involvement documented across several major cities, a disturbing trend that placed Randall's case at the extreme end of a growing phenomenon rather than as a complete anomaly. The most illuminating aspect of Dr. Ortiz's testimony concerned the gamification techniques evident in Randall's notebook, which he identified as an increasingly common recruitment strategy specifically designed to appeal to elementary school-aged children. What we see in this notebook is a sophisticated manipulation system that leverages concepts children this age are intimately familiar with from video games, missions, points, levels, achievements, he explained, as pages from Randall's notebook were displayed for the jury. The progression is deliberate and calculated, starting with minor acts of vandalism assigned point values, then gradually escalating to more serious criminal activity, with the final mission, in this case, the shooting, presented as the ultimate achievement that would earn the highest score and advance the child to a higher level within the gang hierarchy. This framing, Dr. Ortiz testified, deliberately exploited developmental vulnerabilities in children Randall's age, who often struggle to fully distinguish fantasy from reality, and whose understanding of death lacks the permanence and finality that adults comprehend. Dr. Ortiz's testimony took a particularly disturbing turn when he explained why gangs were increasingly turning to child soldiers like Randall to carry out their most serious crimes. There are three primary motivations for this trend, he stated, referring to research data projected on the courtroom screen. First, children this young raise less suspicion. No one expects an elementary school student to be carrying a weapon or to pose a threat. Second, children are neurologically predisposed to follow adult instructions without questioning, especially from authority figures like parents. But the third and most calculating reason is that gang leaders understand the juvenile justice system's limitations in dealing with extremely young offenders. They're exploiting a gap in the system, using children as weapons precisely because they know those children can't face the same consequences an older teen or adult would face for the same crime. This strategic exploitation of both childhood psychology and legal limitations appeared to resonate strongly with the jury, many of whom looked troubled as they considered the implications of adults deliberately weaponizing children's developmental vulnerabilities. The testimony of former gang members proved particularly powerful, with 20-year-old James Twist Rodriguez, a former West Side Locos member, now participating in a rehabilitation program, providing direct insight into the gang's operations and the decision to recruit Randall Conklin. It started maybe 2 years ago, Rodriguez explained, having been granted limited immunity in exchange for his testimony. The older guys started talking about how we needed to use little soldiers because juvie is like a joke if you're under 12. You do a year, maybe 2, then get out with a clean record. Rodriguez described how Randall's father, Daniel Conklin, had first suggested his son might be useful to the gang during a meeting where members were discussing retaliation for an attack on West Side Locos territory. Daniel said his kid was smart, followed instructions, and best of all, nobody would suspect him. He said Randall already played those shooter games, so he'd know what to do with a real gun if we showed him once or twice. Rodriguez's testimony corroborated much of what had been found in Randall's notebook, confirming that the missions and point system had been deliberately designed to normalize criminal behavior by framing it as a game. We'd tell him stuff like, "You leveled up," or "You unlocked a new achievement" when he completed a mission, and he'd get all excited like it was a video game thing, Rodriguez recalled, his expression suggesting a growing discomfort with his role in exploiting a child as he spoke. For the smaller stuff, like tagging or being a lookout, we'd give him snacks or let him hang out with the older guys, playing video games for real. But for bigger missions, he'd get actual points in that notebook, working toward getting his own colors and tag. When asked directly about the murder, Rodriguez confirmed that it had been presented to Randall as the ultimate mission, with Daniel Conklin telling his son that taking out an enemy player would earn him full membership status and respect from all the older members. Perhaps the most damning testimony regarding adult manipulation came from Randall's grandmother, Elaine Conklin, who had initially provided his alibi, but later admitted to police that she had been instructed to lie by her son, Daniel. Appearing frail and visibly distressed on the witness stand, Mrs. Conklin described how Daniel had called her the morning of the shooting, instructing her to sign Randall out of school for a fictitious dental appointment and drop him off at a specific location. I asked what was going on, but Daniel just said it was important for the family and that I didn't need to know the details, she testified, her voice barely audible at times. I should have asked more questions. I should have known something wasn't right when he said to make sure Randall was wearing that blue and white shirt. Her testimony revealed not just Daniel Conklin's direct orchestration of the events leading to the shooting, but also how he had exploited his own mother's trust and desire to avoid conflict, creating layers of manipulation that extended beyond Randall himself. The defense's case began with testimony from Dr. Sarah Levine, a developmental neuropsychologist specializing in childhood brain development, who provided the scientific foundation for understanding Randall's limited capacity to form the mental state required for the charges he faced. The brain develops from back to front, Dr. Levine explained, using a three-dimensional model of the brain to illustrate her points. The prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for impulse control, consequence assessment, and moral reasoning, is quite literally the last part of the brain to develop, not reaching maturity until the mid-20s. In an 11-year-old like Randall, this region is profoundly underdeveloped, making children this age neurologically incapable of the same level of reasoning, judgment, and impulse control that we expect from adults or even older adolescents. Using colorful brain scans that showed the dramatic differences between adult and child brains, Dr. Levine demonstrated that Randall's actions needed to be understood in the context of his neurological limitations rather than adult standards of behavior and comprehension. Dr. Levine's testimony became particularly relevant when she addressed the concept of death understanding in children Randall's age. Research consistently shows that complete understanding of death's permanence, what we call death irreversibility, isn't fully developed in many children until age 12 or older, she explained, citing multiple studies displayed on the courtroom screen. Children Randall's age often still hold magical thinking about death, believing on some level that it might be reversible or temporary, similar to characters in video games who can be respawned or brought back to life. This is not a failure of morality, but a normal developmental stage. When asked directly whether Randall could have fully understood that shooting Michael Turpin would permanently end his life, Dr. Levine responded, "Based on both the scientific research on developmental psychology and my clinical evaluation of Randall, it's highly unlikely that he possessed the cognitive capacity to fully comprehend the permanence and totality of his actions, especially given how adults deliberately framed the act in video game terminology that further blurred the line between fantasy violence and real-world consequences." The most anticipated testimony came from Dr. Robert Hendricks, a forensic psychiatrist who had conducted multiple evaluation sessions with Randall and reviewed all the evidence related to his mental state before and during the shooting. "What we're seeing here is a perfect storm of vulnerability and exploitation," Dr. Hendricks testified. "We have a child at an age where parental approval is paramount, where fantasy and reality boundaries are still developing, where consequence understanding is limited by neurology, not choice, and we have adults who deliberately exploited each of these vulnerabilities to weaponize this child for their purposes." Dr. Hendricks described in detail how Randall's father and other gang members had systematically conditioned him through the gamified approach documented in the notebook, creating a distorted reality where gang activities were normalized and reframed as achievements rather than crimes. Most devastatingly, Dr. Hendricks addressed Randall's understanding of the shooting itself, based on their clinical interviews. When I asked Randall what he thought would happen to Michael after he shot him, his answer was telling, "Dad said he would just be gone, like when you defeat a boss in a game." When I asked if he understood that Michael would never come back, that his family would never see him again, Randall appeared genuinely confused, saying, "I didn't think about that part." This testimony struck at the heart of the legal question before the jury, whether Randall, despite his actions in physically carrying out the shooting, possessed the mental state necessary for the premeditated murder charge he faced. In my professional opinion, Dr. Hendricks concluded, Randall lacked the cognitive capacity to form the specific intent required for premeditated murder, both because of his developmental stage and because of the deliberate manipulation that framed his understanding of the act in terms he could process as a game mission rather than taking a human life. Throughout these expert testimonies, Randall remained largely expressionless, though occasional flickers of recognition or distress crossed his face when specific aspects of his manipulation were described, particularly during Rodriguez's testimony about how the older gang members had encouraged his participation through video games and treats. His mother, whose presence throughout the trial had been permitted by the judge's special accommodation, showed more visible emotion, often crying silently during descriptions of how her son had been exploited during the hours she was working to support their household. The jury's attention frequently shifted between the expert witnesses, the evidence displays, and Randall himself, their expressions reflecting the profound difficulty of reconciling the scientific testimony about his limited capacity with the undeniable fact that he had nonetheless ended another young person's life. As the testimony phase of the trial neared its conclusion, both prosecution and defense had presented compelling narratives about Randall Conklin's actions and mental state on September 23, 2019. The prosecution had established through irrefutable forensic evidence and witness testimony that Randall had physically carried out the shooting that killed Michael Turpin, acting as part of a gang-motivated territorial dispute. The defense had not contested these physical facts, but had built a case around Randall's limited capacity to understand the full implications of his actions, particularly given the systematic manipulation by adults who had deliberately exploited his developmental vulnerabilities. The jury would now face the difficult task of determining whether an 11-year-old who had pulled a trigger could be held legally responsible for murder, or whether the adults who had engineered every aspect of the crime, from providing the weapon to selecting the target to framing the act as a game mission, bore the true responsibility for Michael Turpin's death. The closing arguments would begin the following morning, with the case soon to be placed in the hands of 12 citizens tasked with finding justice in a situation where traditional concepts of culpability and childhood innocence had been thrown into unprecedented conflict. The courtroom fell into absolute silence as the jury filed back in after just 4 hours of deliberation, a surprisingly brief period given the complexity of the case and the profound questions it had raised about juvenile culpability, adult exploitation, and the nature of justice itself. Judge Eleanor Martinez had instructed the jury on the various charges and legal standards the previous afternoon, following powerful closing arguments from both the prosecution and defense that had left many in the courtroom visibly moved. Senior Deputy District Attorney Emily Davis had asked the jury to find Randall Conklin guilty of first-degree murder while acknowledging the moral bankruptcy of the adults who had manipulated him, while defense attorney Maria Vasquez had made an impassioned plea for the jury to recognize that Randall lacked the developmental capacity to be held fully accountable for a crime engineered by adults who had deliberately exploited his youth. Now, as the jury foreperson stood with the verdict form in hand, The tension in courtroom 3B was palpable, with journalists poised to rush out with the news, and Randall's mother gripping the bench so tightly her knuckles had turned white. We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant Randall Conklin guilty of murder in the second degree, the foreperson read, her voice steady but subdued, revealing the jury's compromise verdict that rejected both the prosecution's request for a first-degree murder conviction and the defense's hope for manslaughter or acquittal on grounds of diminished capacity. The charge carried a maximum sentence of 15 years to life in California, though for a juvenile defendant, this would be served in youth facilities until adulthood, with numerous opportunities for earlier release through rehabilitation programs. Randall himself showed little visible reaction to the verdict, his face maintaining the same carefully controlled expression he had displayed throughout much of the trial, though those seated closest to him reported seeing his hands tremble slightly before he clasped them together on the table. His mother covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs that seemed to express both relief that the verdict hadn't been worse and devastation that her 11-year-old son now stood convicted of murder. Judge Martinez thanked the jury for their service before addressing the unprecedented situation before her. "This case has presented questions our justice system was not designed to answer," she began, her normally authoritative voice softened with evident emotion. "We have a child who committed an adult act, but who did so under circumstances of extraordinary manipulation and exploitation by the very adults who should have protected him from harm." The judge announced that sentencing would be delayed for 30 days to allow for additional psychological evaluation and consideration of appropriate placement options, given Randall's age and the unique circumstances of the case. This court's responsibility is not just to address the terrible act that took Michael Turpin's life, but to recognize that we have in the defendant both a perpetrator who must face consequences and a child who was himself victimized through calculated exploitation of his developmental vulnerabilities. Outside the courthouse, reactions to the verdict split along predictable lines, with victim advocates expressing satisfaction that Randall had been held accountable, while children's rights groups decried the prosecution of an 11-year-old for a crime orchestrated by adults. Michael Turpin's mother, Tasha Turpin, addressed reporters with remarkable composure given the circumstances, her grief visibly tempered with compassion. "My son is still gone, and nothing this court does can bring him back to me," she stated, standing beside a large photograph of Michael in his basketball uniform. "But I don't hate that little boy. I hate the adults who turned him into a weapon and pointed him at my son. They're the ones who should be spending the rest of their lives in prison." Mrs. Turpin confirmed that she had requested a meeting with Randall as part of a restorative justice approach, hoping that direct conversation might help both of them process the tragedy that had connected their lives forever. Throughout San Diego, community reactions reflected the complex moral questions raised by the case, with many expressing relief that Randall would receive treatment and rehabilitation rather than purely punitive consequences, while others questioned whether the verdict adequately addressed the exploitation that had led to the crime. Local churches and community centers held prayer vigils for both Michael Turpin's family and for Randall, recognizing the dual tragedies that had unfolded. One life ended violently, another childhood destroyed through manipulation, and the burden of actions no 11-year-old should ever be positioned to commit. "There are no winners today," Reverend Michael Thompson told the congregation gathered at First Baptist Church of San Diego for a community healing service. "Two families have been devastated, and our community must now ask itself how we failed to protect both these children, Michael from violence and Randall from those who exploited his vulnerability." In the days following the verdict, attention shifted to the parallel prosecutions of the adults involved in orchestrating the shooting, with Daniel Conklin and 3 other West Side Locos members facing charges of conspiracy to commit murder, child endangerment, and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. The evidence against them was substantial, including the text messages directing Randall to the park, the testimony of former gang members about the deliberate plan to use a child as the shooter, and the notebook documenting the systematic grooming process. Legal experts predicted these adult defendants would face far more severe consequences than Randall himself, with potential sentences ranging from 25 years to life in prison if convicted on all charges. The adults who engineered this crime specifically chose Randall because they believed his age would shield them from serious consequences, District Attorney Richard Martinez explained at a press conference announcing the charges. Our office is determined to prove that weaponizing a child for murder carries the most serious penalties our justice system can impose. 30 days after the verdict, as mandated by the judge, Randall Conklin returned to Courtroom 3B for sentencing, the intervening month having brought significant changes to his appearance and demeanor. The carefully maintained mask of control he had worn throughout the trial had begun to crack, revealing glimpses of the child beneath the defendant as he entered the courtroom, looking noticeably smaller without the formal suit, now dressed in standard juvenile detention attire. Psychological evaluations conducted during the intervening period had confirmed Dr. Hendricks's earlier testimony about Randall's limited understanding of the permanence of death, while also noting that removal from his father's influence and intensive therapy had begun to allow Randall to process the reality of what he had done in ways he had been unable to during and immediately after the shooting. He's beginning to understand that Michael is never coming back, Dr. Catherine Reynolds testified during the sentencing hearing, and that understanding is appropriately devastating to him in ways that reflect his true developmental stage, rather than the artificial detachment that was conditioned into him. Judge Martinez's sentencing decision reflected the unique circumstances of the case, balancing the need for accountability with recognition of Randall's age and the extensive adult manipulation that had led to the crime. Randall Conklin, this court sentences you to a term of 12 years in the California Youth Authority with eligibility for earlier release upon demonstration of rehabilitation and completion of educational and therapeutic programs, she announced, specifying that Randall would remain in juvenile facilities until at least age 18, with any subsequent incarceration to be determined by periodic review of his progress and ongoing psychological evaluation. The judge also mandated comprehensive mental health treatment, educational support, and complete separation from all family members implicated in the gang activity that had led to his manipulation, a provision that effectively severed Randall's contact with his father and several other relatives pending the outcome of their own trials. Before concluding the sentencing, Judge Martinez took the unusual step of directly addressing Randall in age-appropriate language. "Randall, what happened to Michael Turpin was wrong, and you played a part in that wrong by pulling the trigger," she said, her tone firm but not harsh. But this court also recognizes that adults who should have protected and guided you instead used you as a tool for their purposes, exploiting your trust and your age. Your sentence reflects both the seriousness of your actions and this court's belief that with appropriate treatment and education, you can still grow into a person who contributes positively to society rather than being defined forever by the worst thing you've ever done. This balanced approach, acknowledging both Randall's actions and the exploitation that had enabled them, reflected the judge's attempt to find justice in a case that defied conventional categories of guilt and innocence. As court officers prepared to lead Randall back to the juvenile detention facility where he would begin serving his sentence, a moment occurred that hadn't been scripted or anticipated by anyone involved in the proceedings. Randall suddenly turned toward the gallery where Tasha Turpin, Michael's mother, sat watching with the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout the trial. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking with what appeared to be genuine emotion, breaking through the conditioned detachment he had displayed for so long. "I didn't understand, but I do now. I'm sorry I took him away from you." The spontaneous apology, delivered in the unguarded voice of the child Randall still was beneath the weight of his actions, brought tears to the eyes of many in the courtroom, including several jurors who had returned to witness the sentencing of the defendant whose fate they had determined. Tasha Turpin's response was equally unplanned and equally powerful. Rising from her seat, she nodded once in acknowledgment of Randall's apology, her expression conveying both the grief that would never leave her and a recognition of the tragedy that had engulfed this child as well. "I forgive you, Randall," she said clearly, though her voice trembled with emotion. "But I will never forgive the adults who put that gun in your hand." This exchange between the mother of the victim and the child who had killed her son captured the complex human reality beneath the legal proceedings. The irrevocable harm done, the recognition of manipulation and exploitation, and the possibility, however fragile, of healing and redemption, even in the aftermath of terrible violence. As Randall was led from the courtroom, the case that had captured national attention and sparked intense debate about juvenile justice, gang exploitation, and the responsibilities of communities to protect their children entered a new phase. The legal questions had been resolved through verdict and sentencing, but the broader social questions remained. How could a system better protect children from exploitation by adults willing to weaponize their developmental vulnerabilities? How could communities address the gang influences that made territorial disputes worth killing and dying for? And how could society balance the need for accountability with the recognition that children, even those who commit terrible acts, deserve protection and the chance for rehabilitation rather than pure punishment? These questions would continue to reverberate long after the cameras left the courthouse steps, and the nation's attention moved on to other stories, leaving San Diego to grapple with the complicated legacy of a case that had forced a reckoning with the darkest intersections of childhood vulnerability, adult exploitation, and justice system limitations. 5 years after the shooting that claimed Michael Turpin's life and forever altered Randall Conklin's childhood, the eastern section of Balboa Park had been transformed from a contested gang territory into a community peace garden dedicated to youth violence, prevention, and reconciliation. Where basketball courts had once stood witness to a shocking act of violence carried out by a child manipulated by adults, now carefully tended flower beds, meditation spaces, and a central memorial fountain created a sanctuary designed to honor Michael's memory while promoting healing and reflection. The Michael Turpin Memorial Garden had been created through a partnership between the Turpin family, local community organizations, and, surprisingly, the Juvenile Rehabilitation Center where Randall Conklin continued to serve his sentence, with young offenders participating in the design and initial planting as part of their restorative justice programming. A bronze plaque at the garden's entrance carried a quote from Tasha Turpin that had become something of a mantra for the various initiatives that had grown from the tragedy. From the darkest soil of our collective failure to protect our children, we must now grow something that will shelter the next generation from similar harm. The prosecutions of the adults who had orchestrated Michael's murder had proceeded with the full force of both state and federal law, resulting in severe consequences that contrasted sharply with Randall's juvenile sentence. Daniel Conklin, Randall's father and the primary architect of his son's exploitation, had received a sentence of 35 years to life after being convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, child endangerment, and contributing to the delinquency of a minor, with federal charges related to gang racketeering, adding additional decades to his incarceration. 3 other West Side Locos members implicated in planning the shooting or providing the weapon had received similar sentences, their trials featuring the damning text messages, notebook entries, and testimony that revealed the calculated decision to use an 11-year-old as their instrument specifically because of his age. The defendants before this court exploited a child's trust and developmental vulnerability to commit murder by proxy, Federal Judge Raymond Ortiz had stated during sentencing. This represents one of the most morally reprehensible strategies this court has encountered in 20 years on the bench, and the sentences imposed reflect that extreme culpability. For Randall Conklin, now 16 years old, the journey through the juvenile justice system had been marked by intensive therapeutic intervention, educational achievement, and the slow, painful process of coming to terms with the reality of what he had done. Housed at the California Youth Rehabilitation Center in northern San Diego County, Randall had progressed through increasingly comprehensive treatment programs designed to address both the trauma of his exploitation and the responsibility he bore for his actions. Dr. Catherine Reynolds, the forensic psychologist who had evaluated Randall before his sentencing and continued to oversee his treatment plan, noted his developmental trajectory. In her most recent assessment, Randall has moved from the dissociative state in which he initially viewed the shooting as a mission or achievement to a developmentally appropriate understanding of the permanence of death and the profound harm his actions caused. This progression has been accompanied by appropriate grief, remorse, and a commitment to making whatever amends are possible, recognizing that nothing can bring back the life he took. Education had become Randall's primary focus during his incarceration, with teachers noting his exceptional academic abilities once freed from the gang influences that had begun to undermine his school performance before the shooting. He had completed high school-level coursework 2 years early, earned perfect scores on standardized testing, and begun college-level studies through a program that allowed juvenile offenders to work toward degrees while serving their sentences. Randall represents the tragic paradox at the heart of his case, his current case manager, Sofia Martinez, explained during his most recent progress review. He is a gifted young person with enormous potential who was weaponized precisely because of his intelligence and reliability, his capacity to follow instructions without questioning authority figures. We're now seeing what might have been had those same qualities been nurtured toward positive ends rather than exploited for violence. Perhaps the most remarkable development in Randall's rehabilitation journey had been his relationship with Tasha Turpin, who had followed through on her request to meet with her son's killer through a restorative justice program designed to bring victims and offenders together in structured, therapeutic settings. Their initial meeting, occurring 2 years after the shooting, when Randall was 13, had been brief and emotionally fraught, with Randall barely able to maintain eye contact as he apologized directly to the mother of the young man whose life he had ended. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he had said, his voice barely audible in the recording made of the session. "I just want you to know that I understand now what I did, and I would do anything to take it back." Tasha Turpin's response had been equally measured. "I don't hate you, Randall. I hate what was done to you and what you were manipulated into doing to my son. But if you really want to make amends, you need to become someone who helps prevent this from happening to other children." That challenge had gradually developed into a cautious mentorship, with Tasha visiting Randall quarterly to discuss his progress and share stories about Michael, helping Randall understand the full humanity of the person he had killed rather than the dehumanized target his father and other gang members had presented. These conversations had evolved into a collaborative project, a curriculum for elementary schools designed to help young children recognize and resist gang recruitment tactics, with Randall providing insights from his experience of being manipulated and Tasha offering the perspective of a parent whose child had been lost to gang violence. The Michael Turpin Protection Program, as it had been named, had been piloted in 10 San Diego elementary schools, with plans for countywide implementation the following academic year, creating an unexpected legacy that sought to prevent similar tragedies by addressing the vulnerability of children to adult exploitation. The wider implications of the case had rippled through California's juvenile justice and child protection systems, prompting significant policy changes and increased resources for early intervention programs. State legislators, motivated by the public outcry over how easily Randall had been recruited and manipulated, had passed the Michael Turpin Child Protection Act, which mandated enhanced screening for gang influence in elementary schools, created new criminal penalties specifically for adults who recruited children under 14 for criminal activities, and funded after-school programs in neighborhoods identified as high risk for gang recruitment. This case forced us to recognize a blind spot in our child protection framework, State Senator Gabriela Morales, the bill's primary sponsor, had explained during the signing ceremony. We had systems designed to protect children from abuse within families, but inadequate mechanisms to identify and prevent the kind of calculated exploitation that turned Randall Conklin into a weapon against Michael Turpin. San Diego's law enforcement approach to gang activity had undergone its own evolution in response to the case, with the creation of a specialized youth exploitation prevention unit within the police department, staffed by officers with additional training in child development and psychology. We realized we needed to view very young gang-involved children primarily as victims of exploitation rather than as offenders, explained Captain James Rodriguez, who oversaw the new unit. That doesn't mean there aren't consequences for harmful actions, but it shifts our primary focus to identifying and prosecuting the adults who are recruiting and manipulating these kids. The unit had achieved notable success, identifying and disrupting several operations that had attempted to use elementary and middle school children as drug couriers, lookouts, and in one case, as potential participants in another planned shooting that echoed the strategy used with Randall Conklin. The educational system, too, had implemented changes directly influenced by Randall's case, with school counselors and teachers now receiving specialized training to recognize signs of gang recruitment and exploitation that might have identified Randall's involvement before it escalated to violence. Lincoln Elementary School, where Randall had been a student, had become a model for these interventions, implementing a comprehensive program that included regular check-ins with students showing risk factors, extended after-school programming to minimize unsupervised time, and parent education workshops focused on recognizing signs of gang influence. The most heartbreaking aspect of this case was learning that Randall had been keeping that notebook documenting his missions for months before the shooting, Principal Margaret Chen reflected during a professional development session for educators. He was sitting in our classrooms every day while being systematically groomed for violence, and none of us recognized the warning signs. We cannot let that happen to another child. For the West Side Locos and other gangs operating in San Diego, the aftermath of the case had brought intense law enforcement scrutiny and community pushback that significantly disrupted their operations and recruitment capabilities. The successful prosecution of the adult gang members involved in Michael's murder had been followed by a series of RICO cases that targeted the gang's leadership structure, with federal authorities using the evidence uncovered during the murder investigation as a foundation for broader racketeering charges. The Randall Conklin case opened a window into their operations that gave us leverage to pursue much more extensive prosecutions, explained U.S. Attorney Sofia Ramirez. The public outrage over using a child as a triggerman also undermined community tolerance that had allowed these gangs to operate in certain neighborhoods, leading to increased cooperation from witnesses who might previously have remained silent. As Randall Conklin approached his 17th birthday, the question of his eventual release and reintegration into society loomed on the horizon, generating renewed public discussion about juvenile justice, redemption, and second chances. Under the terms of his sentence, he would be eligible for supervised release after completing specific rehabilitation benchmarks and reaching his 18th birthday, a prospect that had already drawn both support and opposition from various community factions. Tasha Turpin's continued advocacy for Randall's rehabilitation had been particularly influential in shaping public perception, with her willingness to see beyond her own devastating loss to recognize the exploitation that had led to it, creating space for a more nuanced conversation about juvenile justice than might otherwise have been possible. "I lost Michael forever, and nothing can change that," she stated during a community forum on juvenile justice reform. "But I refuse to let his death be the reason another young life is thrown away. Randall was a child who was turned into a weapon, and my son would want us to break that cycle, not perpetuate it." For his part, Randall had begun speaking about his future with a cautious hope tempered by the permanent awareness of what his actions had cost Michael Turpin and his family. In a journal entry shared with the court as part of his most recent progress review, he had written, "I know I can never undo what I did, and I will carry the weight of taking Michael's life forever. But Ms. Turpin told me that the best way to honor Michael is to become someone who protects other kids from being used the way I was used. I don't know if I deserve a second chance, but if I get one, that's what I want to do with it, help other kids recognize what I couldn't see until it was too late." This commitment to prevention and education had become central to his rehabilitation plan, with Randall working alongside therapists and educators to develop materials that used his experience to help other vulnerable children resist similar exploitation. On the 5th anniversary of the shooting, a dedication ceremony for the completed Michael Turpin Memorial Garden brought together many of those whose lives had been transformed by the tragedy: Tasha Turpin and her family, educators from both Michael's high school and Randall's elementary school, officers who had investigated the case, legislators who had championed the policy changes that followed, and community members committed to sustaining the prevention programs that had emerged from the collective soul-searching the case had prompted. Randall Conklin, still serving his sentence, was permitted to attend under supervision as part of his restorative justice program, marking the first time he had returned to Balboa Park since the day of the shooting. Standing slightly apart from the main gathering, flanked by juvenile justice officers, he listened as Tasha Turpin addressed the assembled crowd, her voice carrying across the garden that had replaced the basketball courts where her son had died. "5 years ago, we lost Michael to an act of violence that revealed failures at every level of our community. Failures to protect children from exploitation, failures to address the conditions that make gang membership seem attractive, failures to recognize the warning signs before tragedy struck," she said, standing beside the fountain that served as the garden's centerpiece, its flowing water designed to symbolize continuity and renewal. "But from those failures, we have built something new, programs that protect children, policies that hold exploiters accountable, and a commitment to seeing the humanity in everyone touched by violence, including those who perpetrate it." As she spoke, Tasha looked briefly toward Randall, their eyes meeting in a moment of shared recognition of the journey they had traveled from adversaries to unlikely allies in preventing similar tragedies. "This garden honors Michael not just by remembering him, but by growing something positive from the soil of our loss, something that will shelter other children from the harm that claimed my son and that stole another child's innocence by turning him into a weapon." As the ceremony concluded and attendees dispersed to explore the garden's peaceful pathways, the case that had forced San Diego to confront the darkest possibilities of juvenile exploitation had also, paradoxically, created space for hope, Not the easy hope that ignores harsh realities, but the hard-won hope that emerges from directly confronting systemic failures and committing to repair them. The basketball courts, where a child had been manipulated into taking another child's life, had been transformed into a space dedicated to protection, prevention, and the possibility of redemption, even in the aftermath of seemingly unforgivable acts. And in this transformation lay perhaps the most meaningful legacy of the case, the recognition that true justice requires not just accountability for harm done, but also a commitment to addressing the conditions that enable such harm, particularly when those conditions exploit the vulnerability of children who deserve protection rather than weaponization.